Good evening, everyone. My name's Anne Dobbing, and I'm a member of the core group of the Scottish Laity Network. And tonight it's my privilege and pleasure to welcome you to the second evening of our Towards Pentecost 2022 series. And tonight we're listening and responding to the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. And our topic for this evening is listening to the cry of the poor, with a particular focus on poverty in Scotland. And our companion for the evening is Lawrie Klein. But as we gather together this evening, our thoughts and prayers are so much still with the people of Ukraine, and we begin our evening in prayer for them. And we're also for people who are suffering in Syria, Yemen, Palestine, Iraq, and all the people all over the world suffering due to war and violence. So let's spend a little minute in prayer for all of those people. In the context of the war in Ukraine and all the wars and acts of violence and aggression that are not reported in our mainstream media, we again recall the words that Pope Paul VI powerfully proclaimed 50 years ago: if you want peace, work for justice. And as followers of Jesus, we know we are called to be peacemakers. But the poet, prophet and peacemaker Daniel Berrigan challenges how serious we really are about being peacemakers.
We have assumed the name of peacemakers, but we have been, by and large, unwilling to pay any significant price. And because we want the peace with half a heart and half a life and will, the war, of course, continues. Because the waging of war by its nature is total, but the waging of peace by our own cowardice is partial.
Last week, John Deere powerfully challenged us to reflect on how serious we have been about being peacemakers and fully embracing the total non-violence of Jesus. Tonight, as we continue our Towards Pentecost journey, we also remember the words of Pope Francis. He said at his general audience on the 3rd of June 2015, continuing his series of reflections on the family and focused on the family and poverty. And in his address, he linked war and poverty. War is always a terrible thing. It strikes above all the civil populations, the families. Truly, war is the mother of all poverty. And so tonight, we're focusing on listening to the cry of the poor with a focus on poverty in Scotland. And we are again delighted that Pax Christi Scotland are co-badging our session tonight. And I welcome their chair, Marion Pallister, who will say a few words about Pax Christi Scotland, and then welcome and introduce our companion for this evening. Over to you, Marion.
Thank you so much, Anne, and good evening. And thank you for welcoming us yet again on this Pentecostal journey. As I've said before, Pax Christi Scotland hopes to do what it says on the tin, to work for the peace of Christ here in Scotland. Our understanding of that peace is wide-ranging. The big headline-grabbing issues of peace must be part of what we do, but there can be no peace in a world that discriminates in any way against our brothers and sisters. And as Pope Francis reminds us in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, we are all brothers and sisters. There can be no peace in a world that doesn't hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And so Pax Christi Scotland hopes to reach out to the marginalised, to those who experience on a daily basis poverty that's exacerbated by the increasing gap between the very small minority who hold the wealth of the planet and the very large majority who struggle to exist. We have members throughout Scotland, and the pandemic has done us the same favour that it has done for the Scottish Laity Network, in that we discovered the power of the internet, and our events are facilitated like this one by Zoom. And we've been honoured to have many international speakers join us to discuss all of these issues. And of course, you can keep up to date with those events and all that we do through our website. And I think that the link to the website will go out with a recording of this event. And of course, we're on Facebook and Twitter daily, so do follow us there. On this election day, I posted on our social media pages that while Pax Christi Scotland doesn't do politics, we agree totally with Archbishop William Nolan, who in a Justice and Peace letter a couple of years ago said it was our duty to exercise our vote so that politicians would know what we want of them: honesty, justice, and peace. Violence is experienced in many ways. There is a very obvious violence wrought upon the people of Ukraine. There is the violence created by a deliberately hostile environment, such as that engendered by the Westminster government against those seeking asylum in this country. There is the violence perpetrated against women, physical, emotional, controlling, that leaves them excluded from many areas of our society. And there is the violence perpetrated by austerity measures and insensitive policies against those pushed to the margins of society by increasing debt, increasing difficulty in making ends meet, increasing difficulty in maintaining the dignity that Catholic social teaching tells us is the right of every one of our brothers and sisters. As a Catholic peace organisation, we strive for the principles of the social teaching of our Church that together add up to peace of mind and peace itself, for the common good, for solidarity, for the option for the poor, for the dignity of work and participation. We clearly share so much of that with our companion this evening, Lawrie Morgan Klein, Public Affairs Officer with the organisation Step Change. Lawrie's work with this debt charity exposes him to the range of challenges that each and every one of us might face, but for the grace of God. He has described the charity as being the ambulance dealing with debt emergencies, and seeks a government in Scotland that provides a safety net to prevent financial difficulties escalating. Often in introductions, we hear a long list of academic achievements and a resume of places worked, accolades received. I can tell you that in the past, Lawrie has worked as a parliamentary researcher at Westminster and in Scotland, as a parliamentary assistant, and as a political campaign organiser. But I want to introduce Lawrie in a different way. If you're thinking that being public affairs officer with Step Change is for him just another job, one in which he monitors and influences policy and political developments in the Scottish government and its likely impact on clients, then I think we get a better idea of our companion this evening from a personal assessment. Someone who knows Lawrie well says, Lawrie is a man of kindness, integrity, and compassion, who is respected and admired for his principles, defending people who are struggling and standing against those who try to bully or belittle others. That's the kind of man Pax Christi Scotland really likes. Welcome, Lawrie Morgan Klein. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I think I knew who your anonymous source was, Marion, and it was very kind to say those things of me. But you know, just like the rest of you, we are just striving on and trying to do the right thing. And one of the things when I kind of left politics, as it were, behind, I was really glad to come and work for an organisation that was at the forefront of tackling poverty. And actually, sometimes the frustration in politics is you feel very distant from the things that you're actually there to do. And so much time is spent on that minutiae. But for a debt advice charity, which is what Step Change is, that minutiae is not there at all. What you're doing, your bread and butter, is assisting people. And I'm really glad, although I don't provide the debt advice myself, I'm very pleased to be a part of an organisation that helps so many people. I'll just share my screen. Here we go. So I've got a few slides, but I promise it won't be death by PowerPoint, and I won't just be dully reading out the slides, which is something I do really not like when I'm attending events myself. So I might make the odd reference back, but they're more as a part that they're a prompt to me as well to make sure I mention things, because as I always say to people when I sit down and meet with them, I say, look, this is going to be a bit depressing, and I sometimes feel a bit like I vomit out everything related to debt and poverty and how difficult things are for many thousands of people right across the country. But at the same time, there's ways forward. There's things that we could do to make things better. And some of those things are small things. They're things that we can all do a bit more ourselves in our daily life. But I'll come on to that a bit later. So thank you again, Ryan, for that kind introduction. I'm the Public Affairs Officer of Step Change Debt Charity in Scotland. So public affairs is one of these. A friend of mine was laughing the other night because we were visiting a wind farm, and I sort of remarked, "Oh, I saw a public affairs job advertised for this wind farm," and he said, "Oh, public affairs." Oh, I kind of laughed. It's like, isn't everything public affairs? And well, yeah, in a way it is. But my role is really about lobbying. So going into Parliament, going into local authorities and getting a hold of our MPs and MSPs to talk to them about why issues around problem debt especially need to be a priority. But first I'll just maybe tell you a little bit about Step Change. So we've been in existence over 25 years now. Coming up, we're kind of closer to our 30-year anniversary than 25 years. We were the foundation for credit counselling before. Now, I often say one of the kind of frustrations, and it's one of the things that's part of my role at the charity, is that we're too well kept a secret. not a lot of people necessarily know us. They might have heard of Citizens Advice, for instance, or Christians Against Poverty, or some of those other organisations, but we're there and we do many of the same things, focusing very specifically on the debt part of the picture. And we help people right across the UK. We were actually founded in Leeds, and that's where our head office is today. But we've got a big team in Glasgow now, which just in the time I've been, we've gone from just under 40 full-time money advisors there providing that debt advice to well over 60 now, approaching 70. And unfortunately, while it's good we've been able to grow to meet the rising need, what's happened is the need has risen that we've had to do that. So as I said, we're a debt advice organisation. We focus, we kind of think of ourselves as a specialist when it comes to debt. So whereas your Citizens Advice might be able to offer the more holistic, the full range of advice, we're the specialists that can really hone in on debt. And we're also a telephone provider, first and foremost. That's how we started out, on the phone. And we're also now available online 24/7. And it's when you look at some of the statistics around that online usage, especially, it's people in the middle of the night that can't sleep, that are going on, they're looking at debt advice and they're looking at what the solution to their problem debt might be. And that's the main thing that we focus on. So we don't just provide the advice, we also support someone through. The idea being that someone picks up the phone or goes online with us, and we'll take them from that point. It's usually a point of crisis, all the way through, whether that's months or years later, to that person being debt-free and have escaped that kind of burden problem debt. We work with over 900 different organisations. We work with a lot of lenders, many of whom refer clients to us for impartial advice. If you're ever on the phone with and God forbid, in difficulty, and you say to your bank, your credit card provider, your loan provider, that you are in difficulty and you're struggling to manage, we are one of those organisations that they would refer on to, because we can provide that impartial advice and look at what your situation is, and looking at that situation holistically. We also offer extra support for clients that we would class as vulnerable now. That word vulnerable, I think, has a lot of baggage. It's sort of quite weighted. On the one hand, everyone who feels they need to get advice to deal with problem debt is a vulnerable person. They're certainly financially vulnerable. But one thing that we're very conscious on, we've done a lot of research on over the years, is that there are many things in people's lives that increase their vulnerability, make it harder for them to deal with their finances. And we have a special team that provides some of that support, whether that's a disability, illness, or otherwise. We'll come on to that a little bit later. So who we are, as I said, we kind of were there to be that, from that day dot crisis point, take people from that crisis point to being debt free. And what we want is, we're not an anti-debt charity. I mean, we recognise that the world we live in now, the way the financial system is, we live in a society where, I'm speaking to you from a mortgaged house, and, we're not an anti-debt charity, but we're there to help when debt becomes unmanageable. And that's where our mission is. It's to provide that free and impartial service for people. And also, which is more my side of the charity, is influencing public policy, and also some of the practice that goes on around debt collection and how certain credit products are designed around that. And our values, I think, are really important. And the first thing that is at the forefront of all our minds and is well, what difference is this making to clients? The client is at the center of what we do. And we were there to make that change happen for those individuals. Maybe sort of problem debt's one of those terms that sometimes needs a bit of explaining. So sometimes it's called unmanageable debt, which is essentially it's what it says on the tin. So it's where you're essentially you're paying more in debt than you've got coming in. There's sort of many different aspects to this, and no client really comes to us with the same issues and coming from the same place. But broadly speaking, what has happened is they've had a financial situation that's been manageable, they've been sort of confident to deal with, and they've been happy to control until something that just crops up, a life event, a life shock. It might be a boiler in the house breaks and needs replaced. It might be a car breaks down, a vehicle that you might rely on for work. It could be a myriad of different things. It could be falling ill. It could be taking on caring responsibilities. All of these things, they might start. It's a bit like an avalanche. I sometimes describe it. It's sometimes one pebble can start a massive rock slide, can't it? And for somebody that that event, that car breakdown, that that having to limit your hours because you're now caring for an elderly relative, that maybe is not the catalyst. That's maybe not the thing that causes you to be in difficulty. But what we know from our research is that as soon as one of these things goes wrong, your vulnerability to more really starts to mount. And again, the first call that I try to do as much call listening as I can. And when I say call listening, that would be listening into a call that an advisor has had with the client, just to sort of keep me in touch with what's actually happening for our clients, many of the issues they raised. The first call I heard was the woman, she'd gone into her bank. She couldn't afford her credit card repayment. And she had made this call. She was in tears. She was standing outside her bank. They'd given her number, and she'd right away immediately, because she wanted to get control of this issue, she picked up the phone to us. And the advisor was kind of able to calm her down and provide that bit of support to her and talk through what some of the issues were. And it turned out that the reason her credit card bills had become too hard for her to manage, they'd gone from a perfectly manageable level, was that her son had become unemployed. He was a tradesman. He did have a trade, so he was doing sort of what work he could. But he'd come home to live with her, and she'd been paying some of his debts as well at that point. Now, as the call went on, what actually became apparent was that wasn't the big thing that went wrong for her. The big thing that went wrong for her was 5 years before. She'd had a really severe flooding in her house. She'd lost all her white goods, everything. The whole house had needed refurbished, essentially. It was a bungalow. So this poor woman, that one event, that event she couldn't control, that she couldn't plan for, that she didn't realise that there was a risk of flooding where she was. It was one of these once in a generation, once in a lifetime, once in 100 years events, and she'd been caught out on that. And that had meant that when something else went wrong, her resilience to respond, her financial resilience to that, was really reduced. And it meant that when one thing started to go wrong, others start to go, and we call that a kind of a debt spiral, really. So, and what begins to happen is people begin to they naturally think, and we've all done this, and the metaphor I use, if you've ever been at the counter paying for something with a card, and the card first doesn't work, and I don't know about you, but I certainly, you have this like moment, oh, what's going wrong that that's not worked? And then it might not work again. You don't want to use it a third time, because that could cause a problem with the card. So you get another card out. So in my case, it would be, got my personal card, I've got my joint account. You'd say, oh, I'll try this one. I'll transfer the money back in later on. But what's happening for many people in problem debt is they can't meet that initial payment, and they do the exact same things. That, right, okay, my council tax bills come in. I wasn't planning this. I had the big expense last week with the car. What will I do now? Well, I'll have to put this on a credit card and I'll pay it off next month. And the example, I had a little meeting with Rab a few weeks ago. I were talking about this. The example I used was, this has happened to me. My wife and I, we got a parking ticket. We just got a car, and the parking we were, that's terrible. And we were parked on street, and we sort of got our times wrong about when it was okay to be parked there. So it was a £30 unplanned for. We just bought a car, so that was a bit of a tight month. So we paid that fine, of course, and then thinking the next month I need to make sure that I cover that £30 that's gone on to. So these things, they can happen to all of us, and they can happen at any time. And we know that I talked about people's financial vulnerability earlier. Before the pandemic, there were over 5.7 million people across the UK who were showing some signs of financial distress. And there might be a whole sort of myriad of different things, but the more of these things that are affecting you, these different signs, that might be you're using your overdraft every month. As I said, you're using your credit to cover your day-to-day costs, your day-to-day living expenses, whether it's your food shopping or your main bills. All of these things are mounting up. Now, before the pandemic, we had this. Now, what's something I think that many of us can all agree, I'd be surprised if anyone said that they didn't think that the past 2 years have been something of a crash course in what a life shock is, and an event that's unplanned, that we can't control and that we can't intercept. And that's affected many people financially too. Well, I've talked a lot about problem debt, but we're here to talk about poverty. And I have one of the reasons why I was really delighted to come and speak at this. Although as I say, my focus is naturally on problem debt. I think sometimes we neglect to see that problem debt and poverty are inextricably linked. Now, I say that these issues that I'm discussing, problem debt, it can affect people in all income brackets, and we've supported people in all income brackets, but it's primarily intertwined with poverty. It's almost like the twin of poverty is problem debt, and there's a few sort of key illustrations of that. So our benefit system now is actually immediately on receipt of your first advance payment of universal credit, places you in debt. You're in debt to the state to that first payment, and the recovery of that universal credit advance over a number of months, that comes off your future payments. So you're in debt for months, receiving less than you're entitled to under universal credit to pay for this advance. So the benefit system itself now has we've built in debt to that system, and I have to say it's one of these sort of thorny things. People think, oh, yeah, I'm sure it's the payday lenders. They must be really difficult for you to deal with, and that's the often surprising thing is actually the difficulty. The greatest difficulty that our advisors have, it isn't commercial lenders. There's bad behaviour and there's difficult behaviour, and it can be very difficult for clients. But from our point of view, these organisations that are out there in the high street that are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority, they're obliged to treat their clients fairly. They're obliged to make sure that there's certain, that there's an avenue for impartial advice, which is where we often come in. But I tell you, the type of creditor, if you will, that is not bound by that is the state. So the DWP, HMRC, and local authorities through council tax and rent debt. If you're in difficulty, and certainly, if you took a straw poll, if you had a group of advisors who give debt advice sitting with you, I guarantee you that one of those, I've just listed those kind of state government organisations that people owe their money to, have far more far-reaching power to reclaim that debt. And I mentioned earlier about universal credit. Actually, if that was, say, a high street agreement, they'd lent you that money, they wouldn't be able to recover at the same rate. It would be too high a rate of recovery. Without getting into the weeds of it, it would leave that person with not enough to get by. So they wouldn't be allowed to put this arrangement in place. But of course, the state is able to do that. So the benefit system itself, in the way that's structured now, immediately places people into debt. We also know that inflation is such a severe issue for us all at the moment. I don't know about you, but my bills when we're out in the shops noticeably more expensive, and benefits are not going up in line with that inflation. So you're still getting the same amount of money, but it's going much less further, and that's a big issue, for many people right across the country. The other issue is, that kind of precarious term, precariat. And we know that precarious employment, being in that kind of breadline precarious circumstances, it leaves you much more vulnerable to financial difficulty. It makes finances much harder to manage. If you don't know what your income is going to be one month to the next, trying to plan ahead with your finances is incredibly difficult. So there's a significant interplay there between poverty and problem debt from that regard. We know that people on low incomes tend to be in precarious work. And of course, the pandemic has had such a big impact on people at work now. I think really heavily, and we saw a big increase in people under 25 contacting us in the first months of the pandemic in 2020. And of course, I was sort of looking through these statistics, and actually what had happened there was that students or other young people who are maybe more likely to be in that kind of precarious employment, hospitality, for instance, suddenly went from having regular income that they could know, oh, it's okay, I know that bill's come in, but I'll do some overtime that last week of the month and that'll see us through. Well, that option wasn't available to many people last year. We also know about the poverty premium, which has been talked about a lot in recent years, and that's how actually when you're poor, things cost more money. Whether it's you take areas which are in areas of multiple deprivation, cash machines in these areas, there's a big controversy over this over a number of years, are far more likely to charge you, and you might not, for the cash withdrawal, and you might not be able to travel to somewhere where you can get your cash for free because you don't have the money for that public transport. So we know that the poverty premium, not only is it things more expensive when you're poor, but that equally applies to access to credit. So and it is quite logically related. If you are on a lower income, you're going to be lent to a higher interest rate if people lend to you at all. And what ends up happening in the debt spiral that I was talking about earlier, people begin to exhaust the cheaper, more affordable forms of debt that are available to them, and steadily they begin to think, well, I'm having to rob Peter to pay Paul this week, and then next week I'm now going to have to deal with that bill that's going to come in. And what begins to happen is people begin to they use their loan, they use their credit card to pay their loan, and they might use their overdraft to clear the credit card. And actually you think about overdrafts now, sort of a very the way that the product's positioned now is that it's sort of, oh yeah, well, I remember my wife told me when she was at university, when they were setting up accounts. What the bank said was, "Oh, what's your student loan payment? Oh, it's whatever amount it was. We'll set your overdraft limit to that then." And of course, the cynicism of that is you're kind of entrenching someone in an overdraft, and overdrafts are actually one of the most expensive forms of debt out there, though there has been some regulation in that space that we've campaigned for in recent years, which is really welcome. So poverty premium, there's a big impact on the type of credit that's available to you. I mean, if you're on a good income, you'll likely qualify for a low interest rate credit card. You'll likely qualify for a good rate on a loan or a mortgage. But if you're not in that comfortable financial position, you'll have to pay more for your credit. And it's a natural, it's a sort of further, it's sort of, let's take the situation and make it much more difficult now because you don't have the same tools available to you. And we also know that vulnerability is a big issue that I was talking about earlier. So people who are ill or disabled are facing many of these, they're much more likely to be living in poverty than on a high income. So obviously that's not a rule. As I said, problem debt can affect people on all income brackets. But it's very clear that if you're particularly reliant on DLA or PIP, many of these other issues, life's just harder for you. Your earnings are limited. We know that disabled people earn less. There's been a lot of good research on that in recent years about how even people who are working full time that are disabled are on average earning significantly less than people that are in very good health. And we also know that the mental health pressure of being in poverty and being problem debt is absolutely chronic. I mean, we know that of all these issues that would kind of, and we ask our clients when they come to us, we sort of have a sort of general discussion with them and sort of see how they are and whether they would be in a sort of vulnerable situation. And over half now of our clients are suffering from mental ill health as a result of their problem debt. And of course, sometimes suffering from mental ill health can be a driver behind problem debt, whether you're not able to work as much or you're spending more here and there on things to try to lighten your mood or what have you. We know that that's a big challenge, and that's I've put the statistics in. The other thing that I should say is I've made this deliberately a very sort of try to keep this as stat light as possible, because the other thing that I always apologize for people to when I meet them is I'm so sorry about all the statistics, because it's really terrible sometimes, and so I've tried to keep it as stat light as possible. But I think that one's really important. So that 54% of our clients are vulnerable in 2021. Well, in 2019, it was 44%, which is certainly large, but that's a 10% increase in just 2 years there. It's a really big increase, and it's certainly one that I'm concerned about, and especially when you consider the mental health impact of the pandemic in recent years. The last one there, sort of linking back to that point I was making about vulnerability. So 16% of people have said of our clients that ill health or disability was one of the reasons that they fall into problem debt. So I've kind of sort of talked about this, got a bit ahead of myself a bit about income shocks and how they work and how that causes this spiraling effect. And that's the issue, I think, is that often the coping strategies to deal with this actually end up making the debt problem worse and much more challenging for you. So if you're already spending, and this is a point that I always like to make, because I think sometimes people think that I'm going to be talking to them about people that are spending frivolously or people that are overspending, but actually, and I guarantee you, and I'm sure those of you, many of you would agree, that the best budgeters you will ever meet are people who are on low incomes. They know exactly where to get the most affordable issues. Is one of the things that really irritates me is usually you get a kind of commentator saying something like, oh, well, why are people clearing out food prices? You can get a packet of pasta from Tesco for 54p, that would keep me going. And then actually, and you should definitely have a look at this, but Jack Monroe, who some of you might have heard of, who's the lady who published a cookbook, a sort of budget cookbook, really broke down all the costs about how, well, first of all, why don't you do this for a week? She suggested to this chap, you buy that pasta and that's your main meal for a week, living off that pasta. See if you're malnourished after 6 weeks of doing that. And sort of broke down how actually this 54p thing was a myth, and that this chap would not be able to live on this bowl of pasta, and he would end up in hospital after a period of doing it. And I think my wider point there, people in poverty are the best budgeters you ever meet. And what's actually happening to them is things that they can't control that are forcing them into a problem debt situation. Goes on here. So as I said, the most common reasons for problem debt is really not about lifestyle choices. You'll notice that bought a big flat screen telly is 0% on that chart. You'll notice that you know, the euphemistic lifestyle choices, which people often imply, maybe if these people stop spending their money on drugs or what have you, these things don't come up by and large. That's not to say that there aren't people who do make poor choices, but they are as deserving of support from society to help make better choices and to help them deal with the difficulty that the choices led to, as those who are not. That's maybe a bit of an ideological point, but I think it's a really profound one, and it's really important to this topic. We should be there to help people. We should be there to support better choices, and we are not interested in applying any judgment. But I think it's really important to be clear about this, that the most people that contact us for help and support, it's these issues that they couldn't control. It is reductions to their income, it's changes to their employment, it's unfortunately a new appearance on the chart in the past couple of years, people who directly lost out due to COVID-19, and now seeing a really big increase over the past sort of year. Cost of living increases. We wouldn't have reported on this 2 or 3 years ago, though cost of living was still a problem there. It wasn't one of the main issues that people cited to us, but now that 13% is really high there. And lack of control over finances, that's a sort of a very broad term. It's just so difficult to maintain control when you're at the mercy of so many of these issues. As I said a little there about coping strategies, it's people cutting back on expenditure. Well, if your expenditure is already very low, you don't really have a choice. And actually, it's not enough, because eventually you're going to cut back to such an extent that you're not able to really exist anymore. And I'm particularly concerned about this aspect with energy prices at the moment. So many people now will be self-disconnecting from their energy. We're hearing all the time now about people who, well, I have 1 shower a week, so my kids can have a shower before school each day. You know, all of these issues, especially around energy, are really concerning. It's a great example where people are going to be cold at home. They're going to be more susceptible to ill health, which might limit their ability to work. It's just this cascade of pressure, really, for many people. And I'll maybe come on to a little bit about some of concerns in the future in a bit. But I think it was just important there, especially around coping strategies with energy. You know, it's a really good example, I think, what's happening around the cost of energy. other things like borrowing money from your friend's family, and covering your day-to-day expenses with what credit you can get. I mean, obviously, eventually, and this is often a discussion that advisors will have, well, look, actually, I know I will also money to my mum or my dad or my friend. And that's something that you have to sort of factor into giving the right advice, helping to build that budget, and looking at what the right solution is going forward. So it's a really common way is to, well, I'm going to have to borrow to try and cover this expense. And I think one of the things around that, actually, what people are doing there is they don't want to get out of paying what they owe. They recognise their obligation to pay it, and they want to pay it, and they feel wretched when they're not able to, and that often leads to the mental health problems that we were discussing earlier. And actually, it's often at that point where people they've gone through a budget and what their costs are with one of our advisors, and what our advisors do is maybe a good opportunity just to talk about this, because I should have sketched it out near the start. When someone first picks up the phone to us at that point of crisis, we'll find out what's going on. We'll look at what's been that cause of some of these issues, and we'll begin to identify what that person's living costs are. So how much is their energy? How much is their rent? How much are they paying for food? How much for clothes and shopping do they tend to pay generally? And we'll from that, we can work out what would be the good solution. Now, it might be that there's some things they can cut back on that we can advise on. There might be some things they should actually need to increase their spending on, so that they're able to live with a level of dignity, which is really crucial. And from all of that budget, we then make a recommendation of what might be the best way out. That might be some form of repayment arrangement, which we can support with, or it might be, as I said, looking at a bankruptcy option. And it's one of the most difficult points on the call sometimes, because all the evidence and the discussion points towards, well, I think bankruptcy is the best way forward for you, and people really don't want to go bankrupt, one, because they want to pay what they owe. That's really one of the drivers for many people there. And the other coping strategy, which is one of our challenges, and it's one of the things that I think sometimes leads to people coming to advice quite late, is to bury your head in the sand. And that's such a natural thing to do when you feel that something you don't individually have the answers to, and you don't know what the way forward will be. And so many times when I get to speak to clients, it's that, well, they sort of will relay all these mental health pressures they faced, and then they will come back and they'll say, but after that first call, if I spoke to someone, I realized actually there was a way forward with all of this. There was a way through. And it really does. It's that moment of revelation for them almost. And I spoke to someone and she did use that word. It felt like a revelation that actually I wasn't alone to deal with this, and there was a way forward. And that coping strategy of burying your head in the strand, it might help you get through, but it doesn't help you with the solution. And we know that people realizing they have a problem they're going to need advice with, to actually coming to us or to another advice organization for help, people that can be as long as a year or longer. And in that year, interests and charges is mounting up, all the costs are going up. And part of that is around the stigma of people not wanting to admit, oh, I'm someone who's struggling at the moment, they don't want to come for help, they're not ready at that point yet. Or they think the help's not for them. They think this is for people that are on benefits really struggling, and I'm not in that position. On that point, I should say as well that the majority of people who come to us for help are people that are in work, full or part-time work. And it really shows especially over the past, well, really it's over 10 years now, a lot of the economic pressure, incomes are simply not sufficient to deal with people's everyday living expenses. And I think this is really important. And the first sort of slide I put together for talking to you is, how does this make people feel? And this is a kind of word cloud where we looked at some of the words that clients reported back to us. And we can see there that it's, I find it really powerful to reflect on the amount of strain that people are under with all of these issues, and how out of control it must feel. It's really, there's something deeply unfair about it, that we make people as it's a sort of I sometimes I rail against society sometimes, that we live in a society where feeling like this should be a part of being in difficulty, and many of these feelings are what delay people coming to get help. Ashamed is there, helpless, embarrassed, and guilt. People feel guilty. They feel like they've not been able to manage and everyone else around them has, when actually the truth is that we know from research we've done and other organizations that actually there's, as I said, sort of at the start of the talk, there are many millions of people right across the country that are feeling this mixture of feelings about their finances. That was before the pandemic. That was before this cost of living crisis and inflation above 7% and energy price rises. We're actually not alone. And one of the things that we've done recently, and probably I'll be able to see it if I hold it up. No, it's not so good. We produced a debt advice guide to give out across libraries and community centres and issues like this, just to help people know that there is advice out there. And we know that that one of the key messages we had was, you're not alone with this. And that was one of the main things that we tell to clients when they first call us: look, you're not alone with this. We're with you now. And there's many thousands, if not millions, of people across the country struggling with this. So you're not alone was what we called our debt advice guide that we published. And I think it's a really important message, and it's one where we all need to play our part, as I say, in sharing that message that actually it's okay. It's okay not to be okay, as we've kind of become better society in some ways at talking about the pressure with mental health and all the rest of it. Actually, it's okay to be in financial difficulty and to get some advice and help on it. It's not something that you should feel any of these words before us. You should not feel this way for coming to get help, and you'll be treated with dignity and compassion and respect, certainly by our advisors, by others across the free advice sector. So now's the sort of really, really depressing bit, unfortunately, if that wasn't depressing enough. What's coming, and I always feel like I'm laying it on thick, but I'm really worried about what the future is facing for so many people. We've got inflation with a peak. Actually, I look at that line there, 6% projected in April. We've already surpassed that point. We've got record utility and fuel situation. We talk, the speakers were speaking quite movingly about the situation in Ukraine and finding a way forward for peace there. And it's that conflict and how it's affected energy prices is really significant as well. There's no clear way forward on that. It's a really toxic brew. Because we're also now seeing the withdrawal of some of the support measures that were actually quite effective during the pandemic at helping people on low incomes, keep their head above the water. We had the £20 universal credit uplift, which is gone. And we're going to see some of these things really start to pinch. So people are being squeezed from two sides with this. We've also got tax rises on the horizon. We've had the tax rise just there, which people have noticed in their pay packets. We've got future increases to tax, council taxes, but announced it's going to go up, and also our water costs are going up. But it's one of the things that I'll probably come on to talk about council tax in just a little second, because I'm afraid we can't talk about problem debt without talking about council tax in Scotland. But many people don't think that in Scotland, oh, the water's free. And if you look at your council tax bill, you'll see that water and sewage charges are on there too. Now, you can get what used to be council tax benefit or council tax reduction, it's now called, that will, you can potentially have your council tax bill fully reduced there. But for water, you're still having to pay a charge. And there's many a client who thinks, oh, but I'm on council tax reduction. How can I be in debt for council tax? It's the water and sewage charges. So that's people in really extreme poverty in Scotland, which, not to be flippant about it, but good drinking water shouldn't be a problem for people in Scotland. They've incurred a lot of charges, and they've had to, they've not been able to pay, or they've thought they've not been eligible to pay, but these charges have just been mounting up for their water in the background. So we're facing a really concerning situation, I think. Just in the bottom right there, I mentioned about our average client arrears. Now, I say arrears, what we do there is we calculate what somebody's essential costs are. So that's the rent, the council tax, and their utility costs. And if their income is able to cover those bills, we can then begin at working out all the other things that they're going. But if they can't afford those essentials, then we're in big trouble. But we know that on average, our clients come to us with over £2,000 of arrears. Oh, sorry, my phone's ringing in the background there. Another good show there. Over £2,000 worth of arrears. And just in the past couple of months, that's leapt up another £600 after leaping up £600 the year before. So we've got a really concerning situation there. That's essential living costs that people can't afford to cover, and their debt on that is mounting and mounting. So there's some way forwards there. It is a very bleak picture, and I'm afraid this is the reality for many thousands, if not millions, of households right across the country. Certainly many thousands of households that we are currently supporting. I mean, we saw during the pandemic, many clients that we'd set up on different solutions that we'd be able to kind of right the ship for them. We had to go back and, you know, sort of go through advice with them again about what the new circumstances and the pandemic would be. We had many people who had a sort of repayment solutions in process, so they were paying people off over a longer period of time with a smaller amount, and they had a protected amount of spending that they could use to support them in their life. But we know that was an issue there. And one of the things that I think sometimes we're a bit bad at Scotland at knowing about these issues is there's actually in Scotland there's specific legislation for people who are in problem debt. So we have, some people know that we've got bankruptcy laws a bit different. So we have sequestration in Scotland, and we've got something called the minimal asset process, which essentially is bankruptcy, but it's what it says on the tin. It's people who are very low on assets and have got a slightly lower amount of debt. We have a lot of Scottish debt legislation. We have many of it's hundreds of years old, and some of it's more recently been brought in by the Scottish Parliament. I think one of the challenges that we've got now, and certainly that's why I'm in talking to MSPs about at the moment, is how do we improve that debt legislation? Now, previously, we were kind of leading across the UK because we had this sort of debt solution called the Debt Arrangement Scheme, and that allowed people to make a payment towards their debts over a longer period of time at a reduced amount, and they had a lot of protections in place with that, so they wouldn't be harassed by their lenders, and they could over a longer period of time repay their debt without the same difficulty as bankruptcy can cause for people's credit rating. And as I said, people don't want to go bankrupt even when that's the solution for them. So we led the way across the UK, Scotland, but now the UK government is caught up, and it's one of the points I sometimes make when I'm speaking to SNP politicians. Well, those bad Tories that we don't like down there, they've now introduced something, so we're going to have to make sure that any lessons we can learn from what they've done, a new improved version, that we can make some of those enhancements. And that will mean things like making sure that period of time where people are protected from that enforcement action is increased, so that they can have a minimum of 3 months or 6 months of protection while they begin to working with an advice provider like ourselves or Systems Advice. And there's also an issue that's becoming really apparent in Scotland now around what's called bank arrestments. So essentially, this is where someone you owe money to can instruct involve a sheriff officer through court to get your bank account arrested, as it's called, and that would mean that a payment would be taken to cover what debt you owe, and there's a minimum amount that's allowed to remain in your account. Now, that's currently about £530. But that's no longer fit for purpose. £530 to cover all of your expenses over a month, especially when you've been expecting a pay packet to come in. And the way the arrestment works is it deducts from source. So your employer ends up paying back this debt on your behalf almost, and you don't get to see the money while the sheriff officer recovers it. Now, this protected minimum balance is too low, as I say, £530. One, with inflation as it is now, that wouldn't cover costs for many people. And two, now the way the benefit system works with universal credit paid directly into people's bank accounts, that can be a whole family benefit. So you could end up having this money taken to a bank arrestment. And we're in this sort of quite dangerous position now, I think, where you can actually be too poor to go bankrupt in Scotland. So as I said, the minimal asset process that exists for people who are on low or no income with minimal assets, we've very welcome the Scottish Government reduced the fee. There used to be a £90 fee, which is now in most cases, people don't have to pay that fee. Which was a really great, it was brought in on an emergency basis during the pandemic, and that's now being made permanent, which is fantastic news. But there's still an amount of debt you have to enter a bankruptcy. What that means is if you owe, say, £1,000, you can't go bankrupt to clear that debt. But you don't have enough income to enter a repayment solution, and you can't go bankrupt. So what's going to end up happening to this group of people? They're too poor to go bankrupt. And what's going to end up happening is their creditors, their energy companies, their local authorities will realize, oh, wait a minute, we can't make this person bankrupt. But what we can do is these bank arrestments. So until their debt reaches the amount that they can go bankrupt with. So we need to really think, I think, about how this is working. It shouldn't be the case that people can be too poor to go bankrupt. It's sort of a contradiction in terms, and it doesn't seem to work. And that sort of brings me on. We need to make sure that we're getting more sort of specific help, especially to tenants. Now, the majority of people that we advise, at UK level, it's about 80%. In Scotland, it's not quite as much as that. 80% of our clients are living in rented accommodation, with a kind of mix across private landlords and local authorities and housing associations. But we really need to look at getting some specific support targeted at people who are renting. We had, for instance, during the pandemic, if you had a mortgage on your property and you're in difficulty, you could take a mortgage holiday. You could just, well, you might be adding a few months to the end of your mortgage, but you're still going to be in your home. And actually, a lot of people were able to use, well, actually, my mortgage is, whatever amount. I'm not going to pay that. I can use that to cover some of these other bills. And by the end of the year, we'll have cleared that credit card. Great. And then we can start up with the mortgage again. Fantastic flexibility. And it allowed many people to keep their head above the water. But the support for renters was not to the same extent. So people were mounting up the rent arrears and weren't able to address them. So we're really looking at how we need to get some more financial support to people that are especially renting. Now, the Scottish Government had a great scheme called the Tenant Support Grant Hardship Scheme. And this was fantastic. It paid out a grant that allowed people to clear an amount of rent arrears that they could apply for. But that grant has ended at the end of March. Now, that's, as I say, about support measures being withdrawn. That's really unfortunate. We need to be continuing that, because we know that, as I was saying earlier, people will be in difficulty and might wait a year before they actually come and get advice and help and are able to address that. So we're going to see people, and it's very apparent to me when we look at our statistics, that there will be people who are in difficulty from April 2020 that aren't really going to come to advice for years in the future. I am certain that in 5 years' time, if I was doing this presentation, that COVID percentage, if you remember further up the presentation, we talked a bit about people's reasons for being in debt there, and they were saying that COVID was one. That will still be something that people will be saying in 5 or 10 years' time, even, that actually it was COVID. Just like, remember the client I was telling you about, she'd had the flooding in her house 5 years previously. These little things that just, those little rocks that begin the avalanche, we're really going to, people will be in that financially vulnerable position. And so we need to work at how we get some targeted support. And withdrawing the £20 universal credit uplift last October, while we were still in the midst of a crisis and about to enter the part 2 of that crisis with cost of living, was a really a bad move. And we lobbied the UK government hard not to do that. And we're still lobbying them on how we get more support for energy costs and these many other issues. The other answer is we're going to need to make sure there's more advice for people. So if everybody who is in problem debt in Scotland right now went down to their bureau, their local cab, picked up the phone to us or one of the other help services that's out there, well, we wouldn't be able to meet that we don't have the capacity in the advice network. So the government's going to need to spend more on its advice services to help people access the support they need to get themselves onto a firmer footing. And we need to support people to reach out for advice. As I was saying earlier, it's hard and it's very brave to do it. It shouldn't be hard and brave. It should be something that's, as we've sort of said for many years now, there's been that big sort of struggle around, look, if you're feeling unwell, go to the doctor, don't wait. If you find a lump or anything like that, get it checked out, don't hesitate. And we need to have a similar conversation about financial difficulty, because these things do happen. And, you know, that sort of word of those emotions, it's not worth those emotions. They can happen to anyone. So it's now kind of sort of time to for me to sort of shut up and stop, as I say, sort of vomiting out everything about problem debt and poverty, and hear a bit from yourself. I mean, how should we raise awareness of many of these issues? How should we raise awareness of free help and advice? Because like anything, unfortunately, if you Google debt advice, you go off the computer, you do it right now, I guarantee that the first few entries, hopefully we'll be there somewhere. We do pay to advertise. We try to get our telephone number and website out there, but there will be fee charging advice providers that when they suggest a solution, it's a solution that they can take a cut off that will be paid lining their pockets. So there's a real issue around free advice and promoting free advice and talking about it. We're really interested to hear some of your advice. I think the other thing, as I've said, collectively engage our clients here, but really I think that's about society, isn't it? How do we all encourage people to be more open about their finances, talk a bit more about that? How do we make it easier to drive the change as well? So if I was sort of to ask you to do anything after this presentation, if you've sort of thinking on it and thinking about things you could be doing on it, please message your MSP. Please ask them, your MP as well, to be conscious of the impact on problem debt and poverty of the past few months, how we support people with rent and council tax debt. Council tax debt, by the way, it's another aside from me. Council tax debt after credit cards and loans, which are the two most common types of debt people come to us with, it's council tax. It's council tax debt that people have, and on average, it's over £2,000 worth of council tax that people come to us with. Now, I think unfortunately, people's energy bills are going to overtake council tax there in the coming months. But it's something we've got to address. So if that was one thing I would ask, it would be to please contact your elected representatives and encourage them to consider how we improve the landscape around many of these things for people in debt, and how out in your communities, how can we be more involved in the work that you're doing, various groups you might be involved in. When can we, sort of was waving about my debt advice guide. It's all blurry there at the moment, I've just realised, but waving this about, I mean, would you like us to send some of them out to you? And can you help us raise awareness? So I've wrapped it on enough. So I'll now would love to hear some of your thoughts on everything I've had to say, which I'm sure will be more coherent than what you've just heard. I do like to circle back every now and again. But yeah, thank you very much, and look forward to hearing your thoughts.
We're absolutely stunned, Lawrie. We're absolutely stunned.
Have I talked you into submission?
It's. I mean, you've really given us so much to think about this evening. We've got quite a lot of questions actually in the chat boxes, and Rosa and I are going to have a go at feeding those into you, if that's okay. One of the first questions really was it was one of our friends, Gemma, saying that she really didn't know that the benefit system put people in debt, and what can we do to get that changed? And I have a feeling you're going to be sending letters and things to people, but how would you respond to that?
I have to be a bit careful because, of course, Step Change, we're politically neutral, right. So we don't support any party or otherwise. But I'd encourage you on that point to really scrutinise your elected representatives and what their position is on the way universal credit advances in particular work. If you're needing that payment on right then and there, there's many people don't apply for benefits until it's their last port of call because they know they don't want to be on benefits. There's a huge stigma around that. So I would encourage you to contact your elected representatives of whatever party and ask how they would intend to address it. And based on what they say in the colour of the rosette, maybe that would point you in a direction. But I have to be careful and be strictly politically neutral.
Lawrie, we've got a number of questions that I'm going to try and combine related to the impact of poverty on children and young people. We're talking about, and I know this myself as I go into schools that have washing machines to help families who can't afford to fix their machines or buy one, uniforms, food banks. Also, what we're seeing, of course, is children who are anxious don't learn, children who are hungry. And it really does afflict the life chances of children. And it's just within the education system we're working, and we hear a lot about attainment, but what we don't hear how it's linked to poverty and how our children and young people increasingly relying on food they're given to the school, or teachers going out at weekends to deliver food, or giving them on a Friday to cover the weekend. And the children are just ending up in probably quite low self-esteem issues. Is there much being talked about or researched about the impact of all of this on children and young people?
I think, and it was sort of relating to the point I was making initially about how intertwined debt and poverty and many of these issues are. We're in the kind of debate around, disclaimer, I'm married to a teacher, so a lot of what you said there really resonates. And my mother-in-law is also a teacher, and my father-in-law, as some of we know. I really think we are lacking in Scotland a proper debate around, what's the role of education? We focus a huge amount on attainment, but where's the pastoral side of it? And it really concerns me, some of the things that I hear at home, and all of these issues that we know are live issues for many of our clients. And when I talked about that process of building a budget with the client, that's not us saying, oh, you're spending too much on that. Spending 9 times out of 10, it's things like, look, you what about haircuts? You can't put nothing in for haircuts. You have to be able to get your haircut once. This could be a couple of years. You're sort of sticking to this budget, so we're going to need to make sure you have a haircut here. Or, I mean, what about presents? You've got 2 kids. We've got to make sure that we build that into the budget. And it's like, oh well, I just thought if I paid a bit more off my debt, I'd be able to be free of it quicker. And it's like, well, yes, but realistically, the quality of your life is going to be really lowered. And I think, again, that's one of the issues that we're often talking to. It's been up in front of the Scottish Parliament a few times, is there's a tool, essentially, a spending tool, and if someone spends a certain amount over on a certain issue, so say it's telecommunications, they're spending too much, that's highlighted, and that might give a grounds for a lender to think, oh well, actually I'm going to reject this proposal for a repayment arrangement because they're spending this and this here. So what's going on here? I think the amounts on some of this is something that's really not fit for purpose. But I think, to come back to the question, I think we've really got to make sure we're having a properly holistic discussion about what we're doing across society. I think there's so much now. The safety net feels so eroded that families are in that position, that schools are having to step into the breach. And some schools, I think, are very good at it. Others, maybe not so much. And this safety net that's there to catch us when we fall doesn't appear to be catching people in the way that it needs to. And ad hoc, being lucky to have a school that's got that focus on some of the pastoral issues there, that doesn't seem like the right way for me. I mean, the other thing is, I mean, let's sort of reflect, if your parents are feeling that level of all those feelings that we talked about earlier, the big sort of word board of feelings, if your parents are going through that, what's that going to do for your mental health in the future? So we've got this, and again, staying politically neutral, this sort of focus on education and our record in education in Scotland, and also sort of pride in the education system in Scotland. But what about these other parts? We need to make sure that we're having that holistic discussion, I think. I know as organisations that are members of the Poverty Alliance, which does a lot of good work across many different areas where this sort of focus on child poverty. One of the things I think will be really good on child poverty is the increases to the child payment that the Scottish Government introduced. Really glad to see that. That was one of the things that we were echoing many of the calls to double or even go much further than doubling those child payments, because that expenditure will go straight to families that really need it.
There's another really interesting question here come up linking to economic and political justice. I know you can't be political about a particular party, but in the broader sense, do you see any hope being offered by any political party? I believe that charity is brilliant, of course, and support are necessary, but without political justice, it becomes distorted and supports an unjust system. How, and this is a real plea, how do we break through?
I think it's, I'm sort of, I'd love to be able to give a kind of hopeful answer, but I'm afraid if I knew the answer to that question, we'd be breaking through right now. I think we've just got to communicate. I think often, I mean, I did used to work in politics. One of the things that I reflect on was that sometimes my friends say, "Oh, well, I didn't actually vote for your party. Is that okay?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, of course it is." We're not good at having, especially in this climate, these sort of open discussions about politics and about ends and means and objectives. We're in a very kind of emotive political debate that's very angry and very shouty, and there's a lot of that is exacerbating. And I was always, you know, when I was a political campaigner, I always tried to be sort of like, oh, that's okay, don't support us, I'm not going to give you a dirty look and sort of storm off. You know, that's not how this can work. We're all in a democratic society, and I think that really sort of holding our elected representatives to those standards of, well, actually, what's the moral standard here, regardless of whether I might agree with you politically? Can I accept that you're behaving within a moral? Oh, see, I'm getting into party politics now, aren't I? You know, can we all agree there's a certain standard at which we should be discussing issues, and we should be looking at ways forward? And some of those ideas, whatever party, might be very good, others might be not so good. How do we get the best ideas? And I think we just need to be open in our discussion. Certainly one of the things I learned in politics was not to be too entrenched about certain issues. And I'd be really interested if anyone thought anything that any of my takes in the talk there were a bit wrong or seemed a bit wrong to you. It'd be really interesting to hear your perspective on that, because actually, even if you're thinking it from the point of view of changing minds and influencing people, you've got to think, well, wait a minute, what does the other side aren't evil. And we've got to understand that. I think that's really important. But political justice at the end of the day is about holding that higher standard and expecting, I might disagree with you politically, but I can recognize that you're here because you believe certain things and you're going to you know, follow a kind of shared democratic principle almost. And if we want to address inequality, I mean, you know, there's many things about universal credit that on the surface, for instance, would be really positive. So it mimics work. It really helps top up people's income on 0 hours contracts. For instance, if you work 5 hours one month and 12 hours the next, your universal credit will increase and fall, but with that. But it's how these things are being done doesn't quite work. And we need to sort of really focus in on that and be focused on solutions as well. I think And I know I'm certainly guilty of this. I sometimes, as I say, this sort of this vomit of pain of all this sort of problem debt issues that are so complicated and so difficult. But actually, we need to be focused on solutions, and I think that's what we need to be looking for from whatever party. Wait a minute, what's your bottom line here? What's your budget? It was a great thing that I probably will stop talking a second. I was always told, I was sort of, the political culture when I got involved in politics was actually people say, well, wait a minute, no, what's your budget? What you spend? So you say you care about this, but let's look at your budget and how does that actually break down to the issues you care about or say you care about? And I think we need to be having that kind of focused, delivery-focused discussion. What are the results? What are you actually going to change? And we don't reward parties that don't answer those questions. But I'll stop now before I start. Before my rosette comes on.
No, Lawrie, that's fantastic. Thanks so much. I'm sure if you can see in the chat, there's a lot of questions and thoughts, which obviously you've inspired a great deal here. But time is on us, and I'm going to have to hand over to Marion, I think it is at this moment. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll put my email in the chat. If anyone wants to, email me, please do.
Thanks, Lawrie. That's really helpful. Thank you.
Lawrie.
Thank you very much. I've already put your email down in my notebook. Don't worry, I'll be coming after you, Lawrie. Gosh, that is such a lot to take on board, and we must thank you for walking with us on our Pentecostal journey. Your integrity and compassion have been clear in all that you've shared with us this evening, and all is so very, very much. You've helped us to hear the cry of the poor and to know that there's a way to support that option for the poor that Vatican II asks of us. In the nicest possible way, it would be good not to have need of a Lawrie of the charity Step Change, but it's a blessing that Step Change exists and that a caring person like you, Lawrie, is lobbying politicians and organisations to ensure that the cry of the poor is indeed heard. So we thank you for your time and expertise this evening and for the work that you're doing. And we'd like to finish by saying a prayer for you. Loving God, we praise you for the insight and commitment of Lawrie. We thank you for what he has shared with us tonight. We ask that you anoint him anew, such that his life and his work may continue to be empowered by your Spirit. Amen.
Thank you so much, Marion. And we are now going to also offer a prayer for Pax Christi Scotland. God of peace and justice, we thank you for Pax Christi Scotland and all the members and the member organisations of Pax Christi International. We pray that your Spirit will guide and strengthen them in their work of promoting peace, respect of human rights, and justice and reconciliation throughout the world. Amen. And now we're going to close the formal part of our evening by praying for all of us gathered here tonight, that we may go forth empowered by the Holy Spirit. And we're going to use our prayer to the Holy Spirit that was written by our friend Dermot O'Murchu.
Come, Holy Spirit, breathe down upon our troubled world. Shake the tired foundations of our crumbling institutions. Break the rules that keep you out of all our sacred spaces, and from the dust and rubble, gather up the seedlings of a new creation.
Come, Holy Spirit, inflame once more the dying embers of our weariness. Shake us of our complacency, whisper our names once more, and scatter your gifts of grace with wild abandon. Break open the prisons of our inner being, and let your raging justice be our sign of liberty.
Come, Holy Spirit, and lead us to places we would rather not go. Expand the horizons of our limited imaginations, awaken in our souls dangerous dreams for a new tomorrow, and rekindle in our hearts the fire of prophetic enthusiasm.
Come, Holy Spirit, whose justice outwits international conspiracy, whose light outshines spiritual bigotry, whose peace can overcome the destructive potential of warfare, whose promise invigorates our every effort to create a new heaven and a new earth, now and forever.
Empowered by the Spirit, we continue the mission entrusted to us. Come, Holy Spirit, come. Next Thursday, we continue our Towards Pentecost series with Kim Pratt, who will share with us some insights on Is a Circular Economy the Way Forward? Thank you so much to everyone for being with us tonight. Thank you to Marion and Pax Christie Scotland, who've co-badged the evening with us. If you're leaving us now at this point, good night and God bless, and we invite you to log off. But for those who wish to stay and join a breakout room, please stay connected, and in a few minutes we will generate the breakout rooms.